activism, but how would you assess the present state of humanity and the world in general?
Humanity is in a terrible state, and the world is in extreme and potentially terminal crisis. But I don't believe that we are going to destroy this planet, because what I think is actually happening is that we are in an immense evolutionary crisis, and that this crisis has two main sides. A great death, which I think by now is obvious, an environmental holocaust, a massive corporate death machine that is strip mining the world, polluting everything, a media machine that is owned by the corporate machine that is destroying everything. But there's also a tremendous birth taking place, and this birth is obvious now. It's a birth of a new kind of human being. So what is happening is the great death is taking place, an old world is being destroyed, and a new one, which is still very fragile, is trying to be born. No one knows who is going to win or what is going to win. But I believe we have to just pour all of our energies into being midwives of this great birth.
And what do we need to do as individuals to be a part of that, to be a midwife?
Well, the first thing everybody needs to do is to face that this could be endgame if we don't transform ourselves and act from a transformed consciousness. And really facing that, taking it in, being prepared to grieve that, is an act of immense courage, but it has to be done by millions and millions of people. The second thing that has to be done is that everyone who sees how desperate our situation really is, and how mad we are, and how psychotic the governing structures are, really needs to go on an individual journey of personal transformation, to connect with the sacred at the deepest possible level through profound prayer and meditation and practice. And the third thing that everyone is challenged to do, and this is the core of my vision of sacred activism, is really to stop living for their own selfish ends and to start turning up as servants and midwives of this birth in real radical service to a cause they care deeply about with other people. If enough people turn up in these ways, we have a very good chance. But everything depends on millions turning up now with an awakened sacred consciousness and a profound passion to put that consciousness into action.
So how would you describe sacred activism?
Sacred activism is, I believe, the birthing force of this new world. And for me, sacred activism fuses together the two noblest and most potent fires in the human soul. The fire of the mystic's passion for God, that fire that burns in all of the great religions that erected Chartres and the pyramids, that rages in Rumi and Beethoven, that great, great holy fire that is at the core of all of us. And the fire of the activist's passion for justice, the fire that has constantly transformed society and constantly asked us to extend and expand our vision of rights and compassion. When you bring those two fires together, when you fuse them together, a third fire is born. And Teilhard de Chardin said of this fire, someday, after we have mastered the tides and gravity, we shall harness the energies of love. And then for the second time in the history, humanity will have discovered fire. Sacred activism is that fire of the harnessing of the energies of love. And I believe that sacred activism is the force that will transform this chaos into order and bring about the birth of a new world.
So what are the forces acting against that? What are the forces at work here in this drama?
Well, the forces acting against the birth of an embodied divine humanity are so vast and so powerful at this moment, it's almost impossible to describe or discern them all. But I think they have their fundamental origin in our sad fantasy of separation from the divine. And from that fantasy of separation, which has led us to conceive of the universe as meaningless, we have become addicted to the darker side of our nature, to our lust for power, to terrifying greed, to a vision of human life as only being about possessions and materialist concerns. And this has led to a massive destruction of the planet. But that fantasy of separation is very, very strong, and it now has created an entire world system which is extremely powerful. And I'm afraid that this world system that is so powerful is not going to go lightly. It is going to have to be smashed and disintegrated and deconstructed by the divine, and that is what I believe will happen. I believe we'll have a full-scale systems collapse, and that full-scale systems collapse will be terrifying. But will be on a global scale. What happens in an individual mystic's life will be in fact a global dark night. Not the end, but the necessary destruction and chaos that prepares a new creation and order.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes if it's just our inability to actually face our mortality, that maybe that we are a species that could become extinct.
Well, I think we have to be aware that it's not only us that will go extinct. We have already destroyed innumerable species. We're in the process of destroying innumerable species. If it was only us that we were going to destroy, there are moments I think we all might feel, well, that would be perhaps a good thing because humanity is so psychotic. But the great problem is that our breakdown is now affecting every single species on this earth. So I can't be that sanguine about our breakdown because I have a great passion for animals and a great love of the forests and a great love of nature. And for me, our catastrophic cruelty and madness are sources of infinite grief. But it's not just that that makes me want to fight for the future with everything that I have. It's because I think what I've come to understand is that this terrible relapse in history on our part into greed and destructiveness and exploitation and an orgy of selfishness is part of an evolutionary unfolding. It's part of a necessary exploration of our shadow, which is very dangerous because it could take us to the edge of extinction. But if we are able to wake up, if we are able to connect with the divine consciousness that lives within, that divine consciousness can then use all this information about destructiveness to help us change completely our behavior, and with great clarity and compassion, so that we can become co-creators with the divine and in the divine of a new kind of world.
What's your thoughts on the Occupy movement?
Well, I think the Occupy global movement is amazingly hopeful in certain ways. I think it's wonderful that people at last have woken up from the long, long, brutal coma that they've been in and started to see that the death machine really is planning the destruction of this planet and that we will commit mass suicide if we don't change. And I think that people of all kinds are flocking to the Occupy movement, and that's a sign of great hope, a sign of awakening. But the three things that really have to happen for the Occupy movement not to just be a sweet anarchist hippie orgy. The first is that it needs to organize, it needs to create an alternative political party, and it needs to create a set of very adamant, powerful demands, which must include the regulation of the corporations and the insistence that the absolutely unchecked dominance of the corporations of the world should now end, because if that continues, we are finished. So it's very important that the movement gets real. I also think it's extremely important that the Occupy movement consciously adopts a sacred platform without obviously any kind of dogmatic coloration, because this movement, to be effective, will have to accept that it's going to work on the long haul, and you won't be able to have a movement sustained for the long haul without it being grounded in sacred consciousness and sacred practice. And we have wonderful examples of how this can happen. Gandhi's example, Martin Luther King's example, Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela's example. What I'm afraid of is that Western culture doesn't yet have the spiritual maturity or the real experience of tragedy to give this movement longevity. But if it turns out to be a long-lived movement, then it's going to need to get considerably more organized, considerably more savvy, and considerably more sacred.
Even looking at the world from the point of view of the abstract spirit, it's kind of...
well, there's nothing abstract about spirit.
To general consensus there is, to the mass, to general masses. I mean,
Right. But the general masses are totally asleep. Why should we bother about them?
So how do they wake up? How do we wake up? Can you even affect change on those people?
Well, I don't mean, of course, we should bother about them. But to... Well, this is the question that has agonized every prophet and every founder of that religion. You come to understand when you've had your own mystical awakening that everybody potentially has the capacity to be awake. You come to understand that everybody has divine consciousness. There are several different ways in which somebody starts to look for something beyond themselves. And the deepest reason is usually heartbreak, or an attack of despair, or bankruptcy, or a real collapse of their agenda. Well, I think what we're going to see in the world is going to be a massive collapse of all agendas. So at that time it may be that millions of people will realize that they've been worshipping completely false gods, have been fed completely false information, have been whoring after the religion of science, which has not been able to solve any of the essential problems, and will turn in increasing numbers to the deep sources of spiritual understanding that are everywhere. Because you say that people, the general masses, are not awake, and that is true, but in the last 40 years there's been a massive mystical renaissance, which has made available precisely for this time all the great treasures of the mystical traditions and all the great technologies, the sacred technologies of the mystical traditions. They are all waiting for the moment that is coming when the world realizes en masse very clearly that all of our games and agendas are over. And at that moment there'll either be total suicidal chaos, or there'll be, or there might be both, total suicidal chaos and a massive turning inward to turn outward from greater consciousness. And it's for this time that I've prepared the vision that I have of sacred activism, because it needs to be as carefully, clearly presented and as structured and as burst as possible, so that when people are ready, it will be there for them.
How do people that are just beginning to become aware of their sense of mortality, because that's ultimately what it is, right? People generally think they're immortal. We get caught up in our illusion of gadgets and fantasy. What's the first step to develop that? What are steps to develop the sense of self, to go inward, to look
divine
at your shadows?
self.
Yeah. What's the baby step?
Well, the first step is to have the humility to understand that what you understand about yourself is a very, very small part of what you really are. So the first step is to accept that there is a mystery here, very, very much larger than anything you understand, or perhaps can ever understand. And that is a massive step, actually, because it takes getting to your knees before life. So whatever gets you to your knees before life is a very valuable first step. The second step is really to accept that while you may not know this mystery, there have been extraordinary people who have risked everything and suffered everything and given everything, who have been blessed to be awoken to aspects of this mystery. And that these people have been here, and there have been hundreds of them, and they've been in all religions and shamanic systems, and they are our guides. So you're not alone. You have friends from the past and some who are living. The third step is to start to explore the literature, the teachings that are available, and to see which ones really resonate with your own deepest temperament. I believe the mother has cooked the food of religion in many different cuisines. So some will be attracted to Hinduism, some will be attracted to Buddhism, some will be attracted to Christianity. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you find a way that really deeply resonates with your own deepest personality, and join the family of that way that can sustain you and help you. And the fourth step is that once you've chosen this, you really need to work. You need to do the daily, intense, committed, humble work of sacred practice, because only that can make the words that I'm speaking totally real. And when they become totally real, the world is a completely transformed experience, because you see, taste, and know the divine in everything. And that completely transforms your sense of who you are, your sense of who the world is, and your sense of the meaning of human life, and the sense of what actually can be accomplished in human life.
You know, you mentioned The Secret, and I felt the same way you did when I saw it. That,
Yes.
that it's, you know, it's kind of putting magic into greed. But
Well,
you know,
it's The Secret is a sanctification of greed. It's a terrifying document.
I was wondering if that was just like the basics of getting people into believing that there's such a thing as intent, that there's such a thing as...
Why would you have to give such a deep teaching in such a vulgar way if your intent was not to make as much money as possible?
Perhaps it's exactly what you were saying earlier. How do you reach people that never even think like this? What I'm wondering.
Well, I don't think that's
No?
because The Secret hasn't stopped people thinking in greedy, selfish, narcissistic terms. It has sanctified those terms, and of course it doesn't work. Intention is much subtler than anything that The Secret proposes. So what it really has done is to sell short a major truth, wrap it in a vulgar package, and further darken and bamboozle people who are already ensnared in the nightmare of consumerism.
Yeah, it could be that for sure.
It is that. I think that one of the things that I've come to understand is that the divine will wake humanity up. We're too far gone to be woken up by any individual or any human being, although many people are waking up in the middle of this crisis. But the crisis that is really quite far gone, but still unfelt by millions of people, is going to be felt very, very acutely by everybody relatively soon. We're in a divine process. The divine will know exactly how to awaken humanity and what to do to shatter this illusion. So thinking about how to reach people, which is what I've done for 25 years and what all teachers do, is sometimes not the best way to go about it. The best way to go about it is to turn up with your own deepest divine presence, to give everything that you have freely, and to open to people by your presence and by your words and through your own example the beauty and the wonder of what it is to live in another life. That's the most a human being can do, but it's a lot.
And it's actually real. I mean,
Yes.
I even know this project really will have a very little influence really on the shape of things. But what it does do is it does add to the accessibility of ideas.
No, the point of this project is it is going to change you.
Well, that's my personal There's
Yes.
two levels. There's me, and then there's what I'm presenting.
Right. If it doesn't change you, it can't change anybody else.
Right. Yeah.
Because you will have to mix it in the way that reflects your own deepest knowledge of what has emerged through it.
Right.
And this is now a chemical process,
Yeah.
as everything is,
Yeah,
isn't it?
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you go around to talk to people, ultimately, we are always in the process of becoming ourselves.
Well, I don't see myself as doing something that's exalted. I think I'm trying to turn up as an ordinary divine human being, and when I get up and speak, I speak from my heart to people in the deepest confidence that their hearts will resonate. And if I'm not speaking in my heart, their hearts won't open. If I am speaking in my deepest heart, I will find the right words, I will be simple, I will be naked, my whole presence will show the truth of what I'm trying to say, and truth will be communicated in a way that I don't control, because I don't control the truth. I just hope sometimes to be the channel of it, the transparent vehicle of it, insofar as I'm able. And insofar as I'm able, subtle miracles can happen. I've experienced them from other teachers who transformed my life, and I hope that when I'm at my best and at my most lucid and humble, I'm able to do that for other people.
Can you share a moment like that? I know you spoke of a couple last night.
From a teacher, from someone?
That shaped the kind of...
Yes. Well, the teacher whom I loved the most, and the most powerful influence in my life, was a man called Father Bede Griffiths. And when I met him, he was in his middle 80s. And after I'd finished the film that we were making about him, I went back to Paris, and then I heard that he was dying. And I was desolate and devastated because I loved him so much. So I went back to be with him when he was dying. And one night I was stroking his hands as he lay in his bed, very deeply distressed at how much suffering he'd been through during the day, and relieved that he was sleeping. And suddenly, in the middle of the night, he stood up on his bed, gazed at a force that seemed to be coming through the window, and started saying over and over again the four words that have really inspired me most in the last years. He said, "Serve the growing Christ, serve the growing Christ, serve the growing Christ, serve the growing Christ." And I understood as he said that what he meant was that we are to serve the growing Christ in ourselves by evolving inwardly. We're to serve the growing Christ in other people by respecting it and deeply honoring it, even if they don't themselves. And we're to serve this great birth in this tumultuous moment of world history. And that all came from a moment in the hut in South India with a man who was being torn apart by his last illness, but a man who was awake and able to transmit the essence of our whole drama to someone who loved him.
So how do you deal with those moments in yourself, in those moments of conflict, inner conflict?
How do I deal with my own inner conflict?
Yeah, in those moments where it's where you're... Do you teeter? Do you ever teeter?
Oh my God, of course.
So what do you do in those moments?
Well, when I am conflicted, I really want to understand the conflict. I want to understand why it is that I'm experiencing this battle in myself. And so I truly, truly try and be unjudgmental and step back and look at what forces are operating. And when I find where the suffering or the wildness or the despair is coming from, I try to work on it like a mother with her own child. I try to send from my healed divine self, the being in whom I'm living, love and peace and tenderness to that human unhealed self, so that the sources of the conflict can be covered over, healed, appeased. In other times, I simply go into meditation or mantra because I find the saying of the name of God very helpful. And I've come to understand that so much conflict happens because we don't keep our minds, hold our minds in the empty peace, the great spaciousness that they actually reside in naturally. And that the more you can return to that inner quietness, that inner spaciousness, the more the conflicts that arise can be easily dispersed. So it's a technique, it's a self-understanding, but it's also an understanding that grows through sacred practice. You come to understand that the sacred practices really work. They can be used in moments of tremendous suffering and difficulty to bring great joy and peace into the core of that difficulty. And that gives you a much more confident attitude towards life because you realize, crazy though you might be and full of trauma and God knows what, you still have in these practices an infallible source of help.
There's also a third thing that you mentioned, because almost there's like three parts of us. There's our mind, our emotional body, almost, and our physical body, which you mentioned last night, which I really liked.
Yes.
And through yoga, just to make our physical body strong,
yes.
make it a sacred practice.
Yes. That's one other way that you can deal superbly with conflict is to have a very reliable sacred body practice. For me, I find yoga and sacred dance enormously powerful. So often the conflict gets stuck in one's body and you feel almost as if you're being possessed by that conflict. And to be able to do some very simple asanas, some yogic asanas that breathe new energy throughout your body, or to do sacred dance that is such a powerful and passionate way of expressing the conflict in a creative way, that can be very helpful. I think breathwork is very helpful too. I have done some of it, but my friends who do shamanic breathwork say that by learning the circular breathing, which I've practiced too, you can start to release the conflict and the stress within yourself and really process it very fast and get it out, rather than be trapped by it being always gnawing at you. So there is so much help for our stress and conflicts. This is what really should be taught at schools. And people should know these things from very early on in their lives. It would mean an enormous change in behavior and conscious gentleness towards each other, wouldn't it?
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. This is going to be wild.